On the morning of her 62nd birthday, Marjorie Bennett found a birthday card waiting on her doorstep. There was no stamp, no return address, and no name on the envelope. She almost threw it away, thinking it had been delivered to the wrong house. But then she noticed the handwriting. Her hands immediately began to tremble. She had seen that handwriting thousands of times before. It belonged to Thomas, the man she had loved for more than 30 years. The problem was that Thomas had been gone for 18 years. Marjorie stood outside her quiet suburban home, staring at the envelope as memories rushed back. Thomas had disappeared on a rainy evening in October. His car had been found near an old railway station, but he was never found. The police had searched for months. Eventually, everyone assumed he had died. Marjorie had never received a body, never received an explanation, and never truly accepted what had happened. She slowly opened the card. Inside was a simple birthday message. "Happy birthday, Marjorie. I hope you still remember the promise you made to me." Her heart stopped. Nobody else knew about that promise. It was something Thomas had whispered to her on the final night they had spent together. Marjorie immediately called her younger sister, Celeste. When Celeste arrived, Marjorie showed her the card. Celeste stared at it for several seconds before saying, "This isn't possible." "I know," Marjorie replied. Celeste turned the card over. There was a small handwritten number on the back. 17. Neither woman understood what it meant. That evening, Marjorie searched through an old box of photographs and letters she had kept hidden in her closet. She found an old picture taken just weeks before Thomas disappeared. On the back, Thomas had written a date, October 17th. Marjorie suddenly remembered something she had completely forgotten. The night before he disappeared, Thomas had asked her to meet him at a small cafe near the railway station on October 17th. She had never gone. At the time, she had been angry with him after an argument and decided to stay home. It was the last decision she ever made before Thomas vanished. Marjorie looked again at the birthday card. Then her phone rang. The number was unknown. She answered cautiously. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then a man's voice quietly said, "Marjorie, if you received the card, they know I contacted you." Her entire body went cold. She recognized the voice. It was Thomas. Before she could say his name, the call ended. Marjorie stood frozen in her living room. 18 years after Thomas disappeared, he had just called her. And somehow, someone else was afraid she had heard from him. Marjorie couldn't move for several seconds after the call ended. She stared at her phone as if Thomas might call back at any moment. Celeste was standing across the room, watching her carefully. "Who was it?" she asked. Marjorie slowly looked up. "Thomas." Celeste's face went pale. "That's impossible." "I heard his voice," Marjorie replied. "I'd know it anywhere." Celeste sat down, unable to speak. Neither of them knew what to believe. 18 years had passed. Thomas would be 65 now, but the voice Marjorie had heard sounded exactly as she remembered. That night, Marjorie placed the birthday card beside the old photograph. She kept staring at the number written on the back. 17. She decided to search through Thomas's old belongings. In a box beneath her bed, she found his old watch, several letters, and a small notebook she had never seen before. Most of the pages were filled with ordinary notes, but near the end, she found a list of dates. October 17th was circled 3 times. Underneath it, Thomas had written, "If anything happens to me, don't trust the station." Marjorie felt a chill run through her. The railway station had always been part of the official story. Thomas's car had been found there. His wallet had been discovered inside the vehicle. The police had assumed he had either left voluntarily or something had happened to him nearby. But now Marjorie wondered if the station had been used to make everyone believe the wrong story. The next morning, she drove to the old station. The building had been closed for years. The waiting room windows were covered with dust, and the old ticket office had been converted into a storage area. Marjorie walked around the side of the building and noticed something scratched into the brick wall. 17-4-9. She took a picture with her phone. Before she could leave, an elderly man approached her. "You're Marjorie, aren't you?" She turned around. The man introduced himself as Harold Mercer. He had worked at the station 18 years earlier. "I knew Thomas," Harold said. Marjorie immediately asked, "Did you see him the night he disappeared?" Harold looked toward the empty railway tracks. "Yes." Marjorie's heart began racing. "What happened?" Harold lowered his voice. "Thomas wasn't alone that night." Marjorie stared at him. "Who was with him?" Harold hesitated. "A woman." Marjorie felt confused. "What woman?" "I don't know her name. But I remember Thomas giving her an envelope." "What was inside?" Harold shook his head. I never saw. Then he added something that made Marjorie even more uneasy. About 10 minutes later, Thomas came back to the station alone. He looked frightened. He told me that if anyone asked, I should say I never saw him. Marjorie whispered, "Why didn't you tell the police?" Harold looked ashamed. Because someone had already warned me. Who? Harold reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old photograph. It showed Thomas standing beside the same woman. But there was something else in the picture. Behind them was a little boy. Marjorie stared at the child's face. She recognized him. It was her son, Daniel. But Daniel had been told his entire life that he had never met Thomas after the night he disappeared. Marjorie slowly looked at Harold. "What is my son doing in this photograph?" Harold didn't answer. Instead, he quietly said, "You should ask your son what happened on October 17th. Marjorie's phone suddenly vibrated. Another message had arrived from the unknown number. It contained only 5 words. "He doesn't know you're searching." Marjorie looked at the photograph again. For the first time, she realized the mystery surrounding Thomas wasn't just about where he had gone. It was about what her own family had been hiding from her. Marjorie drove home without speaking. The photograph lay on the passenger seat, and every few seconds she glanced at it. Thomas was standing beside an unfamiliar woman, and behind them was Daniel, her own son. But Daniel looked much younger than she remembered him being in 2004. There was something about the photograph that didn't make sense. When she arrived home, Daniel was already there. He was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an old family album. Marjorie placed the photograph in front of him. "Where did you get this?" Daniel asked immediately. Marjorie froze. "You recognize it?" Daniel looked away. "Mom, you shouldn't have gone to the station." "Why?" "Because some things are better left in the past." Marjorie's voice became firm. "Your father disappeared 18 years ago. Someone just called me using his voice. I found a photograph of you with him on the night he disappeared. And now you're telling me to stop asking questions." Daniel remained silent. Marjorie pushed the photograph toward him. "Who is the woman?" Daniel finally looked at the picture. "Her name was Elise." "Was." Daniel nodded. "She died several years ago." Marjorie sat down. "Why was she with your father?" Daniel rubbed his hands together nervously. "Because Dad asked her to help him." "Help him with what?" Daniel looked at his mother. "Leaving." Marjorie felt as though the room had suddenly become cold. "Leaving me?" "No." Daniel's voice cracked. "Leaving someone else." Marjorie stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Daniel explained that a few days before Thomas disappeared, he had overheard his father arguing with someone on the phone. Thomas had discovered that a person close to the family had been secretly taking money from a business account. Thomas planned to expose the person. But before he could do it, he received a warning. The warning involved Daniel. Thomas was told that if he went to the authorities, his son would be blamed for the missing money. Marjorie looked at Daniel in disbelief. "You were involved?" "I was 17, Daniel said. I didn't even understand what was happening." Then Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. "I've had this for 18 years. Marjorie slowly opened it. Inside was a train ticket dated October 17th, 2008, and a handwritten note from Thomas. "Daniel, if your mother ever finds this, tell her I didn't leave because I stopped loving her." Marjorie's eyes filled with tears. "What happened to him?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know." "Then why did you keep this from me?" "Because Dad told me to." Marjorie looked at the note again. At the bottom was another sentence. "Trust the person who remembers the red suitcase." Marjorie frowned. "The red suitcase?" Daniel nodded. "I don't know what it means." But Marjorie did. She remembered a red suitcase. It had belonged to Thomas. The suitcase had disappeared the same week he vanished. She had always assumed the police had taken it as evidence. Now she realized nobody had ever returned it. Marjorie stood up. "Where's that suitcase?" Daniel looked at her. "I don't know." Before either of them could say anything else, someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks. Marjorie walked toward the entrance. When she opened the door, there was nobody outside. Only a small red suitcase was sitting on the porch. Her hands began to shake. There was a note taped to the handle. "You wanted the truth. Start here." Marjorie looked at Daniel. Then she slowly opened the suitcase. Inside was something that made her realize Thomas had been preparing for this moment long before he disappeared. Marjorie stared into the red suitcase, afraid of what she might find. On top was a folded gray coat that belonged to Thomas. Beneath it were several photographs, an old key, and a small cassette recorder. Daniel picked up the recorder and turned it over in his hands. "He left this for you," Daniel whispered. Marjorie pressed the play button. At first, there was only static. Then Thomas's voice filled the room. Marjorie, if you're hearing this, something went wrong. She closed her eyes. Thomas continued. I need you to know that I never planned to disappear. I was trying to protect you and Daniel. Marjorie opened her eyes and looked at her son. The recording continued. The person taking money from the company isn't working alone. Someone inside our family knows about it. I couldn't trust anyone. The recording suddenly stopped. Daniel looked at his mother. There has to be more. Marjorie searched the suitcase again and found a second tape. This one contained only a few seconds of Thomas speaking. Look behind the painting in the hallway. They immediately went to the hallway. Marjorie removed the old family portrait that had hung there for years. Behind it was a small wooden compartment. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. The first letter was addressed to Thomas. The second was addressed to Daniel. But the third had Marjorie's name on it. She opened it carefully. Marjorie, if you are reading this, I failed to keep the truth hidden. The person you trust most may not be the person you think they are. Marjorie stopped reading. Daniel looked nervous. Mom, what does it say? She handed him the letter. Daniel read it and suddenly sat down. You know who it is, Marjorie said. Daniel didn't answer. Daniel. He finally looked at her. I think Dad suspected Uncle Victor. Marjorie froze. Victor had been Thomas's older brother. He had helped manage the family business and had supported Marjorie after Thomas disappeared. For 18 years, Marjorie had trusted him. She had even considered him the closest thing Daniel had to a father. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was scared. Marjorie turned toward the window. Then her phone rang. It was Victor. She answered. Marjorie, we need to talk. About Thomas? There was a long silence. Then Victor said, you found the suitcase. Marjorie's heart dropped. How do you know about the suitcase? Victor didn't answer. Instead, he said quietly, please don't open the final envelope. Marjorie looked at the red suitcase. You know what's inside. Yes. What happened to Thomas? Victor's voice became unsteady. He wanted to tell you everything. Marjorie waited. But he never got the chance. The call ended. Daniel looked at his mother. Mom, there's one envelope left. Marjorie slowly reached into the suitcase. It was sealed with an old piece of tape. On the front, Thomas had written, Open only when you are ready to know why I never came home. Marjorie held the envelope tightly. For 18 years, she had wondered whether Thomas had abandoned her. Now she was finally holding the answer. But before she could open it, someone knocked on the front door. This time, Marjorie knew exactly who it was. Victor. Victor stood outside the house, looking older than Marjorie remembered. His face was pale, and for the first time she noticed how nervous he seemed. Can I come in? He asked. Marjorie didn't move. Tell me why you know about the suitcase. Victor looked at Daniel. Because I helped your father hide it. Daniel immediately stood up. You knew. Victor nodded. I knew what Thomas was planning. I knew he was trying to protect both of you. Marjorie finally stepped aside. Victor entered slowly. He looked at the red suitcase on the table. Did you open the final envelope? No. Good. Marjorie crossed her arms. Then tell me what happened. Victor sat down. Your husband discovered that someone had been using the company accounts without permission. At first, he thought it was a simple financial mistake. Then he found documents showing that the money was being moved through another account. Whose account? Victor looked at Daniel. Your son's. Daniel's face went pale. I never knew about that. I know, Victor said. Thomas knew that too. Someone had used Daniel's name without his knowledge. Marjorie suddenly understood why Thomas had been so frightened. He thought Daniel would be blamed. Victor nodded. That was the plan. Whose plan? Victor remained silent. Marjorie stepped closer. Victor, I waited 18 years for an answer. Victor finally said, Thomas discovered the person behind everything. Who? Before Victor could answer, the phone on the table rang. It was the same unknown number. Marjorie answered. A man's voice said, you should have stopped. Then the call ended. Victor looked frightened. That person knows you're here. Marjorie turned toward the final envelope. She tore it open. Inside was a handwritten letter from Thomas. Marjorie, if you are reading this, I need you to know that I did not disappear because I wanted another life. I left because I was given a choice. I could stay and risk losing Daniel, or I could disappear and make everyone believe the matter was finished. Marjorie's eyes filled with tears. The letter continued. There is only one person who knows where I went. His name is Victor. Marjorie looked up. Victor closed his eyes. I promised Thomas I would never tell you unless the person behind the scheme returned. Marjorie whispered, and now they have. Victor nodded. Thomas is alive. The room became completely silent. Daniel stared at his uncle. You knew Dad was alive all these years? I knew he survived, Victor replied. But I didn't know where he was until 3 months ago. Marjorie's hands began shaking. Where is he? Victor pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. An address was written on it. A small coastal town nearly 4 hours away. Marjorie looked at Daniel, then at Victor. We're going there. Victor shook his head. You don't understand. Thomas didn't contact you because he was afraid the person watching him would find you. Marjorie held the address tightly. Then why send me the birthday card? Victor looked toward the window. Because he finally realized that hiding the truth was hurting you more than revealing it. Marjorie picked up her coat. But before she could leave, another message appeared on her phone. This time, it contained a photograph. It showed Thomas standing outside a small house. And beneath the photograph were 6 words. You are not the only one looking. Marjorie looked at Daniel. The search for Thomas was no longer a question of whether he was alive. It was a race to find him before someone else did. Marjorie and Daniel left before sunrise. Victor followed in a separate car, carrying the old documents Thomas had left behind. The address led them to a quiet coastal town several hours away, where small houses stood along a road overlooking the ocean. Marjorie couldn't stop thinking about one question. If Thomas had been alive all these years, why had he never come home? They finally reached a small white house at the end of the road. Marjorie stepped out of the car. The front door was slightly open. Thomas, she called. No answer. She slowly walked inside. The house was modest, but carefully maintained. There were books on the shelves, photographs on the walls, and a cup of coffee sitting beside an open newspaper. Someone had been there recently. Then Marjorie noticed a photograph on the fireplace. It was her. A picture from her 62nd birthday had been taken that morning. Someone had been watching her. Daniel whispered, Mom. A door opened behind them. Marjorie turned. A man stood in the hallway. Older. His hair was gray. His face had changed. But his eyes were exactly the same. Marjorie's breath caught. Thomas. The man looked at her. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then he quietly said, I'm sorry. Marjorie's eyes filled with tears. You were alive all this time. Thomas nodded. I wanted to come back. Then why didn't you? Thomas looked toward Victor. Because every time I tried, someone stopped me. Victor stepped forward. Who? Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folder. The person who started this 18 years ago. He handed it to Marjorie. Inside were copies of financial records, photographs, and several letters. But the final document made Marjorie stop. It showed that the person who had been moving money through Daniel's account was not Victor. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't even someone connected to the company. It was someone Marjorie knew personally. Someone who had been helping her family for years. Marjorie looked at Thomas. Who is this? Thomas answered quietly. Celeste. Marjorie froze. Her younger sister. The same sister who had rushed to her house when the first birthday card arrived. The same person who had told Marjorie that Thomas being alive was impossible. The same person who had known about the mysterious number from the very beginning. Daniel looked at his mother. Mom. Marjorie couldn't speak. Thomas continued. Celeste discovered what I had found in 2008. She wasn't working alone, but she was the one who knew how to make everything disappear. She convinced me that if I returned, Daniel would be blamed for everything. Marjorie shook her head. She was my sister. Thomas nodded. And that's why I trusted her. Suddenly, Victor's phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was Celeste. He answered on speaker. Her voice was calm. You finally found him. Marjorie stepped closer. Why? Celeste was silent for a moment. Then she said, because I believed I was protecting this family. Thomas shook his head. You were protecting yourself. Celeste's voice became emotional. I made mistakes. But I never wanted anyone hurt. Marjorie closed her eyes. All those years of unanswered questions suddenly had an explanation. But one question remained. Why send me the birthday card? Celeste answered softly. Because I wanted to know whether Thomas would finally come back. Marjorie opened her eyes. So you used me to bring him out? Yes. The call ended. Thomas looked at Marjorie. I should have come home years ago. Marjorie wiped away her tears. You should have. There was pain in her voice, but there was also relief. After 18 years, she finally knew the truth. But the documents Thomas had collected contained more information than any of them expected. And the final page suggested that Celeste had not been the only person involved. Thomas placed the final page of the file on the table. Marjorie stared at it. There were 3 names written across the top, followed by dates and amounts of money. Celeste's name was there, but beside it was another name that made Marjorie's heart sink. Harold Mercer, the elderly station worker. Marjorie remembered what Harold had told her. He had claimed someone warned him to stay silent on the night Thomas disappeared. Now she realized he had known far more than he admitted. Thomas explained that Harold had helped move several documents from the station after Thomas left that night. But Harold wasn't the person behind everything. He had been paid to remain silent. Then who was actually controlling all of this? Marjorie asked. Thomas looked at her. That is what I spent 18 years trying to prove. He opened another folder. Inside were copies of bank records, old photographs, and a letter dated only 6 months earlier. The letter had been written by Celeste. In it, she admitted that she had helped hide the financial records, but she also named the person who had originally convinced her to participate. Marjorie read the name. She couldn't believe it. It was someone she had trusted for years. Someone who had attended family celebrations, visited their home, and even helped search for Thomas when he disappeared. Victor. Marjorie looked at him. Victor slowly lowered his head. Thomas stood up. You told me you were protecting my family. Victor's eyes filled with tears. I was. You helped create the entire situation. I was trying to fix what I had already done. Marjorie couldn't understand. Victor finally confessed. Years earlier, he had made a series of financial decisions that caused the family business to fall into serious trouble. Instead of admitting what happened, he secretly moved money between accounts. Celeste discovered it and became involved because she wanted to protect the family from losing everything. When Thomas discovered the truth, he planned to expose Victor. But Victor panicked. He created the false trail that made it look as though Thomas had disappeared voluntarily. He never intended for Thomas to be gone for 18 years. But after Thomas vanished, everything became more complicated. Thomas had been threatened by people connected to the financial scheme, so he stayed away to protect Marjorie and Daniel. Marjorie looked at Victor. You could have told me. Victor nodded. I should have. Thomas stepped closer to Marjorie. I made the same mistake. I thought keeping you in the dark would keep you safe. Marjorie looked at him through tears. You both decided what was best for me. Nobody answered. Then Daniel picked up the final document. Mom, there's something else. Marjorie turned. The document showed that the remaining family property had already been secured legally in her name. Thomas had arranged it months before sending the birthday card. He hadn't returned to take anything. He had returned because he finally wanted to stop hiding. Marjorie looked at Thomas. So the birthday card. Thomas smiled sadly. I wanted to know if you still remembered our promise. Marjorie whispered, I never forgot. The promise had been simple. If either of them ever got lost, they would always find their way home. Thomas looked toward the ocean. I think it's time I came home. Marjorie smiled through her tears. But before they could leave, her phone received one final message. There was no number. Only 4 words. Now you know everything. Marjorie looked at Thomas. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the past. But there was still one thing left to decide. Could she forgive the people who had kept the truth from her for 18 years? Marjorie stood quietly beside Thomas, watching the ocean through the window. For 18 years, she had imagined this moment in 1,000 different ways. Sometimes she imagined Thomas walking through their front door as if nothing had happened. Sometimes she imagined confronting him with anger. But now that he was finally standing in front of her, she realized the truth was much more complicated. You left me with nothing but questions, she said. Thomas lowered his head. I know. And you let me believe you were gone. I thought staying away would keep you and Daniel safe. Marjorie looked at him. You protected us from the truth, Thomas. But you also took 18 years away from us. Thomas couldn't argue with that. Daniel stepped between them. Dad, I don't know if everything can go back to the way it was. Thomas nodded. I don't expect it to. That answer surprised Marjorie. Thomas wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply asking for a chance to tell the truth. Over the next few weeks, the old documents were turned over to the proper authorities. The financial records were investigated, and the people responsible for the scheme were finally held accountable. Victor admitted what he had done and accepted the consequences. Celeste also confessed her part in hiding the truth. Marjorie didn't forgive everyone immediately. Some wounds needed time. But she finally stopped carrying the weight of questions that had followed her for 18 years. 1 month later, Marjorie returned to the house where she had spent most of her life. Thomas stood beside her at the front door. He looked at the old house and smiled. I never thought I'd see this place again. Marjorie opened the door. Neither did I. Daniel was waiting inside. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Daniel walked toward his father and hugged him. Thomas closed his eyes. It was the moment he had imagined for 18 years. Later that evening, Marjorie found the original birthday card on her desk. She turned it over. The number 17 was still written on the back. She finally understood what it meant. October 17th wasn't just the day Thomas disappeared. It was the day their family had lost its way. And her 62nd birthday was the day they finally found each other again. Marjorie placed the card inside a small box and closed the lid. She didn't want to forget what had happened. But she also didn't want to live in the past anymore. Thomas walked into the room. Ready? Marjorie smiled. For what? To start again. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took his hand. Not again, she said softly. This time, we'll start honestly. And together, they walked outside. For the first time in 18 years, Marjorie wasn't waiting for someone to come home. She was finally home herself. If you were Marjorie, would you forgive Thomas and give him another chance, or would 18 years of silence be too much to forget?